Everybody likes to know how to value their collections or how to set prices when they're reselling, and that's why we share this information. Here are 20 items that we just sold and just shipped very recently in the realm of antique and vintage paper ephemera and books, and this is how they did. We list 20 items each month on eBay auctions, and we do it in part to test the market and just see what the market at auction for these types of things is right now, right where we're standing. And this first piece was really fun. This is Kellogg's Funny Jungleland Moving Pictures. A lot of people find things like this. They were made from the 30s when this was done up into the 1950s and 60s, and they're where they have these anthropomorphic characters and they're cut into strips, and so you can move the strips around and suddenly they have different feet, different legs, they're dancing, they're standing, it's mix and match. It was a fun game for kids, and it's a fun game now. And this one's especially cool because it has advertising for Kellogg's from about the first part of the Depression. This is before Snap, Crackle, and Pop. Notice the Rice Krispies box doesn't have them because Vernon Grant didn't make that design until about 5 years after this was made. So this is pretty early. Now this one we put on as a buy it now, and somebody did buy it right away for $30 full price. And I can see why, because it's such a cute graphic and so fun. And so this one went on one bid. This was also a buy it now. It was presidential inauguration month, and so we wanted to try something from a presidential inauguration in the past. This was from the 1984 inauguration. It was the 50th time that a president had been inaugurated, and Ronald Reagan and company made a big deal out of it. There were events all over Washington, D.C., and someone who was a presidential fan noticed this when we had our member chat and released the video to the public. If you are a level 2 or level 3 member on my channel or on Patreon supporting us, well, you get to see these things early, and you also get to participate in the chat for these videos. And so this person was in the chat for the member video, and they saw this and said, "Ooh, yes." So they went online and grabbed it right away. There's the parade route map. Didn't have a parade this year. It was way too cold. But in 1985, they had parades, they had events all over town, and these two guides are the schedule of events and also the official guidebook. And so they went for $14.99 on one bid. Another presidential campaign item. This one surprised me a little bit. I thought it might sell for a little more. I think the condition was a bit of a problem. You do see these. They were intended to be little signs, maybe license plate toppers, made of tin. They do have a union label, which is rather unusual because the unions were still pretty controversial in the time of Hoover, just plain on the back. This would have been from Hoover's attempt to be reelected, and it didn't go well. And this one sold for $19.99 on two bids. Typically, I would expect these to sell closer for $30 or $35. But again, this is why we do these experiments, is to see, given the condition, given the time in the marketplace, given the sentiments of collectors, what is the market now? We had a number of mid-century mystery books for sale, and I like to show these because these are things you will see at estate sales. A lot of these cozy mysteries, as they called them, were very popular around World War II. This one is from 1943. It's called Honolulu's Story with Leslie Ford. Collier did a lot of these very bright orange book covers without dust jackets, and there were a number of our authors who were involved. This particular piece sold for $12.50 on two bids. That's very similar to the last time I sold one of these, which was about 6 months ago. Here's an unusual piece of paper ephemera. This is a jumbo postcard showing an above-ground nuclear test. The above-ground testing stopped at some point, I believe in the 1950s. There was a treaty signed because they began to realize that above-ground testing was dangerous. But back in the early 50s, they didn't really know that yet. And so people would go and watch these things, much to their peril. A lot of the movie stars involved with the John Wayne movie Genghis Khan eventually died of cancer because they were downwind from one of these tests. It's a very sad thing. We didn't really understand exactly the effects of nuclear radiation when all of this first started, but it is a beautiful and ominous picture. And because of that, I thought it would be interesting, and it certainly was. We got 5 bids on this, and to sell a postcard for $15.50 means it was a pretty decent postcard, because usually postcards sell for a few dollars. So that was an unusual piece, and it had a fair number of bids and a lot of interest. This was really neat. It sold for $12.50 on 3 bids. It is a fishing guide, and it is from Gulf Oil. And the great graphic in the corner is what sold it. Now, it's funny, with paper ephemera, you want to be honest about condition, but I think sometimes with our really advanced photographic methods, you actually end up showing more damage and more distress than there really is. And so in this case, you really see a lot of crinkling, and when you held the piece up close in person, it really didn't look nearly as bad as it does under the camera light. So I think the person who got it ended up being pretty satisfied with it because it was actually in better condition than the pictures really showed. That can be a problem with paper ephemera, and that can affect value. So when you're doing your research, whether it's for your own collection or for things that you're selling on some other online source, do take into account how good was the picture that they put in the ad, because that makes a big difference. This did very well. This is an oversized matchbook, and this has figural advertising on it for Mount Vernon whiskey, rye whiskey, who George Washington's overseer made first. That seems like something to not be incredibly proud of in some ways, but at the time this was made, back in around 1940, that was a selling point. This is an early post-prohibition item. These jumbo matchbooks with the figural matches were very popular. You can tell it's an earlier piece because the striker is on the front. By the 1960s, the striker was moved to the back because there was the danger that you would strike the cigarette with the book open and light all the other matches on fire, and people kept getting burned that way. And that wasn't a really good thing. There's the other part of the advertising. This did rather well. Oversized matchbooks do sell well with interesting advertising. Some of them have anthropomorphic figures on the matches. It is a specialized area of collecting, and so we figured it would have a good audience, and it did. It got 9 bids and sold for $14.50. Considering this is something that was given out free back in the 1930s or 40s, that's a pretty good number. Frances Crane was our featured author. We had 4 books by Frances Crane for sale, and she's a pretty popular author of mid-century mysteries. This one's The Apple Green Cat. Her mysteries always had a color in the title, and this particular one was in good condition. It has the dust jacket. That definitely improves the value. And you can see this also came from a bookshop. It has the stamp in it. Way back when, it sold for about $9.50. That was probably 30 years ago. These came from my mother's collection. She was a lifelong mystery collector, and these have been really interesting for me to learn more about. They typically have a little sense of humor to them, even though they're dealing with death and mayhem. And this one has the various other titles that Lippincott was publishing at that time. There is the inner flap. You can see that this was checked out a number of times from the LaSalle bookshop. And there is the spine with the dust jacket. The dust jacket's not in perfect shape, and that's why, even though it helps having the dust jacket, the price was held down to $20 on 7 bids. That's not a bad price for a Frances Crane novel, however, as we'll see here. This one is the Daffodil Blonde. I love the cover. The lurid covers are really a lot of what sold these when they were sitting in the bookstores originally. And this particular one went for $18.50 on 6 bids. There's a wonderful back on the dust jacket there. Now, the dust jacket is in better shape on this one, but this title wasn't quite as well known or popular as the other titles, so it did not sell for quite as much money. But overall, a very good result, and a lot of fun. These were all decent, intact reading copies. None of them were pristine and perfect. Pristine and perfect or author signed can go for a lot more. Wings Over America, the Paul and Linda McCartney concert poster. This was in perfect condition, but it has creases because it came folded when it was new. It was never poked with any sort of pins in the corner. It wasn't hung with tape. But again, pictures can be difficult with these. This is a large item. It wouldn't fit in the shadow box to take the picture. It looks all crinkled in the corner in a way that really overemphasizes the damage, which was really minimal. I think this side shows the condition a lot better. So I think the person who ended up getting this was very happy with it because, again, pictures are important, and this was not the greatest picture for an eBay listing. And because of that, it only got $11.50 on 3 bids. I would have honestly expected it would probably go for $20 to $25 if we had had a better photo. The Amber Eyes. Now, this was a late Francis Crane novel, and by the 1960s, this style of mystery writing was really going out of style because society was becoming, frankly, more difficult, more violent, more sophisticated in a way, and some of the parlance and the way that these were written wasn't really seeming as relevant. And because of that, this one would not have sold as much new, and it didn't sell as much used either. It did go for $9.99 on one bid to somebody who bought several of the mysteries. And I think that they'll find that it's actually a delightful story along the lines of the earlier pieces that were done by Frances Crane. She was one of the authors who lasted in the mystery writing field the longest. There were a lot of other authors who did half a dozen books in the 1930s and 40s and were gone by the 1950s. But Frances Crane kept writing, I believe, up until the 1970s. This was a cool thing, and the person who bought it had a very specific reason for buying it, having to do with their own interest in Hawaii and having, I believe, lived there at one point, and they were doing some sort of a scrapbook, and this was going to be a feature in it, because this is the King Kamehameha statue. And it was an interesting postcard because it said Hawaii TH, territory of Hawaii, meaning it was before statehood. It was definitely before statehood because it was a pre-linen. Pre-linen means that it doesn't have that texture that the mid-century postcards did. It's a flat surface. And you can see at one time a dealer had actually charged, and I believe got $8 for this piece. We got $6 for this on 2 bids. I was pretty happy with that. And I just love Hawaii, so it was fun for me to see this again. I've been to the statue in person, and it's a really wonderful reminder of when Hawaii was its own free country. This did really honestly as well as I would have thought it could, because it was such a specific set. This is a set of Kon-Tiki collector cards. Thor Heyerdahl, of course, took his raft to show that it was possible to go from the Americas to Polynesia way back with primitive technology. And he made this raft, and he and his crew managed to get to Polynesia from South America. It was quite a feat in the 1950s. And so these cards, which were something you got as premiums in Nestle, if you see the back there, were something you collected until you had the whole set. And so it was great to have the whole set together. I wasn't sure if there were people who would still appreciate this, but there were. There were 2 bids, and it sold for $12.50 for the set, showing all of the different things they encountered and had to deal with along the way. This is a great book. This is a book that is rather collectible, rather valuable, and it did sell for the most of all of the mystery books that we had on this month. And that's one of the reasons that we like to do these, is to show the range that things can sell in. Because you might go into an estate sale as a collector or as a reseller, and you might see a shelf of these books, and they might be $2 each. Because a lot of times with books at estate sales, the people running them don't really take time to research unless it's something that looks really, really old. And while these are 70 and 80 years old now, it isn't something that necessarily jumps out to a lot of people who are not educated about these. So this one was a fun book too. It was by Margaret Scherf, a very talented writer with a very strange name. And she had 3 different characters she wrote for. This one is the Reverend Martin Bewley, and he receives an elk steak from one of his parishioners, and it has a human finger in it, and that is when the mystery sleuthing begins. The thing about a lot of these cozy mysteries, as they were called, is they weren't about detectives like Hercule Poirot or somebody who was a detective for a living. They were about people who were just regular people who somehow ended up involved in murder and trying to figure out what had happened. And it also had a great cover that was very appropriate for winter. So the dust jacket is good. It's a hard to find book, and it got the most bids of any of the pieces we put out. 16 bids, ended up selling for $75. And that is why it's good to know to look for these kind of books. This book is very sweet too. This is Here Comes Mrs. Goose by Miriam Clark Potter. And this is a good book as well. This is one of the first books that she did in this series after World War II. Miriam Clark Potter was a prolific children's writer. There is a whole section of the University of Minnesota devoted to children's books that is named after her in honor of her, because she was a graduate and then became very famous along with her husband. They did the illustrations as well as the books. And so she would have been involved with the decoration of the dust jacket. But the reason this sold so well is that this is a first edition. And it can be tricky to tell if a book is really a first edition or if it just happens to not have a previous edition listed. Now, the dust jacket, as you see, is imperfect, but that didn't really matter because this book is a true first edition. More fun illustrations there. And there is the cover page. And because we knew it was a first edition, and the persons who were bidding on this understood that it really was truly a first edition, it went for a good price of $66 on 15 bids. It's the most we've actually gotten for one of the Mrs. Goose series, and it was one that my mother paid the most to get, so that made sense to me. Now, this is an author we don't see as often. This is Manning Long, and Manning Long is pretty desirable. She was an author who based most of her mysteries in New York. This one is by a different publisher with a wonderful bloodhound on the rear cover. This is from 1945. These books really peaked in popularity around the Second World War because even though they showed murder and mayhem, it paled in comparison to what was happening in the real world, so it was considered a good escape. And here is the cover page, and there is Manning Long. So this book did very well, 3 bids and $33, and I think that was a fair price because her books are a little harder to find. Here's our next Frances Crane, Murder in Blue Street. This one went for $15.50 on 2 bids. Condition is great. It has a good dust jacket. Came out in 1951. Again, this is a little later in her career. Her earlier tomes tend to sell for more. It has an inscription on the inside, to Mom for Christmas. And I like those, but they actually don't improve the value of the book unless it's an inscription from the author. We will be doing another flight this month, and that one will have an author-signed book in it. And I'm very curious to see how that does. So this one went for $15.50 on 2 bids. Here's our other Mrs. Goose now. Look at the difference not having a dust jacket makes. This one went for $9.99 on 2 bids. The lack of a dust jacket means that the front of the cover ended up being soiled and stained a little bit, as you can see. And that definitely affects the value as well. Condition is definitely important on these. And you can see this one has had a little bit of a rough life because it is a children's book. Kids' books tend to be beaten up a little bit more, but still a really wonderful piece and a very cute series and a good reading copy. And so it sold for $9.99. Again, if I'm at an estate sale and I see a bunch of books and they're $2 each, and I see this sort of thing and I know it's a $10 book, I'm going to either buy it for myself or I'm going to buy it to resell. And that brings us to the last piece that we sold. This is a rather obscure book called Happy Holiday. From what we know, this is the only book that Thaddeus O'Finn wrote. He was the winner of a mystery contest put on by Reinhardt Publishing. Reinhardt had a great history because Reinhardt was the brainchild of this woman, Mary Roberts Reinhardt. She was the first person to modernize mystery books from the Victorian prose into what we considered 20th century writing, where the characters typically were in a situation of, if I had but known, I would have never been involved in this terrible thing that I'm now involved in, and now I have to deal with the mystery. And she was the person who really inspired a lot of the other writers. And because of that, she ended up forming her own publishing company, and by the 1950s, she was looking for other authors, and Thaddeus O'Finn won one of the contests she had for new authors, and they published this book. It was a fun book, interesting book. You notice I left the chip from that dust jacket spine inside the book for the new owner. But we don't know of any other pieces that Thaddeus O'Finn did. So there you have it. That's what's sold in our most recent flight of mid-century mysteries, children's books, and paper ephemera. And I hope you enjoy these reviews because we think they're useful for collectors to know where their collections stand and for resellers to have an idea of things we're seeing in the market and what the market thinks of them today. Happy hunting, and we'll see you again soon.
If you enjoyed this video, check out this one. Also, click thumbs up to like this video and check the description for information about our Patreon, our memberships. We've got a lot of different levels with different perks and bonus videos and early content. Also, please do check out our website, theantiquenomad.com, for appraisal help. And we'll see you again for more adventures in the antique and vintage community soon. Bye for now.